Hi everyone, this is another game I played online with a 3-day per move time control. So it was a correspondence game. I was black and we played a Scotch game. And in Scotch game I like to play the classical variation here and attack the knight with my bishop. Just a nice developing move. And he defends with his bishop going down the main line. Queen f6 attacks the knight again, so it needs more defense, and c3 was played. And I wanted to mention, instead of c3, another option is knight b5, attacking the c7 square. But black has a nice resource here. Bishop takes e3, threatens a mate on f2. So white cannot really take this pawn because the king will attack the knight and continue to threaten mate. So instead, f takes e3 must be played. But then I like to play queen to h4 check, g3, and then return my queen to its starting square to defend c7. You can also try taking the pawn on e4 and attacking the rook in the corner. It gets pretty messy though. So here white's pawn structure is just completely decimated. And that's a possible line in the Scotch. Okay, so my opponent didn't play knight b5. He played the mainline move c3. Then knight g e7. So I'm getting ready to castle kingside, but I'm also supporting a pawn push to d5 with that move. So that's the main move. And now a novelty. I don't think this has ever been played in a master game. f3. The engine doesn't really like it. It gives it a score of -1.0. I think it's because it's just too weakening along this diagonal, and white won't be able to castle kingside. And it doesn't help development. It doesn't really address development. The mainline move there is bishop to c4, developing the piece and protecting the d5 square so black can't play d5 on the next move. So f3 looks a little passive and weakening along this diagonal, but it does seem to have a point. When my opponent played f3, I realized he may have a threat now of knight to b5. Let's see what I played. I played castles to stop any fork from the c7 square. So I played very cautiously. And my point is, if I had played some other move, like I was thinking of d6 or d5, let's look at d6, then now knight to b5 is a little different than it was in that other line. Because if I take the bishop, there's no longer a mate threat on f2. And I think that's one of the purposes of my opponent playing this f3 move. And so he can take here and fork. I can move over. I don't want to probably move to the center of the board. And he gets the exchange, but his knight is potentially trapped there. And my bishop looks pretty good on e3 actually. So this was a possible way for me to play. I could probably go up material, but I just didn't want to leave my king in the middle of the board or on f8 there. I wanted to play more cautiously. So I didn't go for this move d6. The engine suggests instead of castling, I actually should have played d5. That was my instinct. When the mainline move bishop c4 is played, it's to discourage d5. So the common wisdom is if white doesn't play that move, then black should play d5. Okay, and now if white did play knight db5, which the engine suggests he shouldn't do, but let's take a look at this line, then I would take the bishop on e3, and he can fork the king and rook. King would move over to the f file. Doesn't want to be in line with that queen there, with that d file potentially opening up. And he can take the rook, and then black can take on e4, trying to open up lines here to the white king, which is in the center of the board. knight to d2 to develop and protect f3 in case I take there again. E takes f3, queen takes f3, bishop takes d2 check, king takes d2, queen to d6 check, queen blocks, and queen to b8 targets that knight in the corner. And so black will have two pieces for the rook. So this was a possible line, and the engine says it's about negative 1.9 in this position. So that move d5 was a good move, but I still don't really like these kind of positions. I'd prefer to play a little safer. Okay, so going back, so I played castles and just stayed away from any kind of messy positions with knight b5. Okay, now my opponent played a good move, bishop c4, which supports the d5 square and dissuades me from playing d5, or so I thought. I played d6, but the engine suggests again I should be playing d5. And I didn't really consider that move for very long because it only has one defender and white has two attackers on that pawn. So I didn't consider it for very long. But if white takes the pawn, then black has the move knight to a5, attacking the defending bishop. And there's a couple different moves here white can try, but if he really wants to hang on to the d5 pawn, he can try b3, so that if black takes the bishop, he can take back with the pawn, supporting the d5 pawn. Okay, but even here, the engine says black has a big advantage. And black gets played on the e file with rook to e8, where that loose bishop on e3 is sitting. So black is threatening knight to f5 in the position, or maybe bishop takes knight first and knight to f5. So the suggested move here by the engine is king f2, just getting off the file and protecting the bishop. Then knight g6, and black can start attacking on the king side. For example, rook e1, queen h4 check, king goes back to g8, and then bishop d6 targeting the h2 square. And so there's some serious pressure on the white king, and the position is about negative 2.0 according to the engine. So white did keep the center pawn on d5, but black gets a lot of activity for his pieces and has a good attack on the white king. Okay, but I played pretty materialistically in this game, and I tried to play pretty safely as well. So maybe I should change my style to this more dynamic way of playing, activating my pieces. But I played the more passive d6. Okay, now look at this knight on d4. It's attacked 3 times, as it was from the opening, and it's defended 3 times. Okay. Well, my opponent forgot about that and played queen c2, removing a defender. So that allows black to win a pawn. I think a much better move there was maybe queen to d2, just supporting that bishop and staying in contact with that knight. But queen to c2 simply drops a pawn. So I take on d4, he has to recapture. I take again, he recaptures, and I get that pawn. And my queen is very well placed in the center of the board, and this diagonal is still weak. So white is not going to be castling kingside. He's going to try to arrange a queenside castle. All right, he offers a queen trade. I don't want to do that and go into an endgame, a mere pawn up, and allow him to castle kingside and get developed in a hurry. So I drop the queen back to b6, still controlling this diagonal, putting some pressure on the queen side. Then knight d2. And now I want to open lines to the white king. So I try c6 to support the d5 pawn push, and then if he captures and I recapture, I'll have an open c file. And I'm expecting his king to castle on that side of the board. And he does, and I play d5. He takes the pawn. Maybe he shouldn't have taken the pawn. He could have just maybe dropped the bishop back and supported this square. But he takes the pawn, I recapture, and he has to drop the bishop back somewhere. He puts it on d3, and now this c file is open, and that's exactly where his king and queen are situated. So I develop my remaining minor piece, and I think it's pretty good on this square because this pawn is mobile. It can go forward, attack the queen, and this bishop would be nicely placed, pointed at the a2 square. Okay, so he has to do something about my threat of putting one of my rooks on c8, attacking the queen, which would force some kind of a block here, and black would win one of white's pieces. So he sees the threat and moves his king aside. Good idea. Now I push my pawn here. Now this pawn was doing a nice job restricting the white knight, keeping these squares in black's control. But sometimes you have to give up some squares in order to get some squares. So I give those squares up, and I open a diagonal for the bishop, and I open a nice square for the knight too. So the knight can come to d5, and then maybe even e6 in some cases. And I gain a tempo on the queen. So he drops the queen back to c2, and the queen is a little vulnerable on that file, so maybe a better move would have been to put it over on a3. Okay, but he puts it on c2, and he creates this battery against the h-pawn. And so again, I play very cautiously here, and I simply play h6, which removes the pawn from threat, gains the king some luft for later on. And the engine says I could have played a much stronger move. It recommends rook f c8, attacking the queen. Now, the point is, he doesn't have the time to take here. This is a common tactical idea because black would remain in contact with the bishop, and now he's attacking the bishop and the queen. The queen has to move somewhere along this diagonal to keep in contact with the bishop, but then black can play g6, trapping the bishop in. So this is something very common. However, white could take the pawn and give up the bishop, and black's up a piece, certainly, and the engine says it's about negative 3.1. But I don't like this kind of position, even though I'm up a piece. It's a bit messy. My king is vulnerable. I mean, his king is vulnerable too, but he can get some play down the h-file maybe. He can push his h-pawn. So I would have to play pretty carefully and not blunder to win this position. Okay, so I didn't want to play like that. I just played the cautious h6. All right, he plays knight c4, attacking the queen, and I make a mistake here. I give up a really strong bishop, and I just reasoned I want a safe pawn advantage. I still have this one pawn, and so he's attacking my queen. I want to save a tempo. I want a nice stable one pawn advantage in an easy boring endgame. But this bishop is really strong. It's pointed at this a2 square, and bishops are generally stronger than knights anyway, so I shouldn't have so voluntarily given it up. The engine suggests playing queen to a6 instead, so that if this knight moves away somewhere over here, somewhere, he's got to watch out for queen takes a2 check. It can move here and block that file. For example, knight to a3 now, releasing an attack on the queen, but then I can simply slide the queen over to b6 and continue playing, and his knight is worse off on the edge of the board, and my bishop is still strong. So I probably should have kept the pieces on the board, but I traded, and then I pinned the bishop to the queen. So he gets out of the pin, he moves the queen, and I play knight to c6 with the idea of playing knight to e5, which would fork the queen and the bishop, and it would also release an attack by my rook on the bishop. So that would win material. That would be a winning fork, knight to e5. The engine suggests a better move was knight to f5 to protect this pawn, instead of knight to c6 to protect the pawn. It seems to be the engine's preference by far, but I didn't like this endgame after queen takes knight, rook takes bishop, and then maybe he centralizes his other rook, and I can push my a pawn towards his king. And black's up a pawn, but I think it's hard to win. You have to play pretty precisely to win an endgame with only heavy pieces on the board being a pawn up. So that might have been a hard win for me anyway. So I think I still, even despite the engine's recommendation, I still prefer knight to c6, keeping these minor pieces on the board, and just guarding the pawn and making this threat. Okay, so he defends against the threat by moving his h-rook to e1, keeping an eye on that square. But then I renew the threat with queen c7, so supporting that square. So now I am threatening to move the knight to e5. Notice I'm also attacking the h2 pawn, and I think that's all my opponent was thinking about when he blundered with g3. He forgot about this threat. And I think that's one of the dangers in playing these correspondence games online. You could wait a couple of days and not make a move and go back, and you kind of forget the plans and ideas, and so you just look at the position with new, fresh eyes, and you forget there was a threat. And so you just play a move. You see, oh, he's attacking my pawn, let me guard that and move on. But I like to take the opportunity to use these correspondence games as serious games and play them like I would play a classical live face-to-face game. And so I want to make sure all of my moves are safe. I want to make sure I'm understanding the position each and every time. And if you check, you probably would easily notice this fork coming. So I do fork, and now when I played that move, I was well aware of all the possibilities here that white could try. I figured out that the best move for white was what he played, which is to give up the exchange, to stop that fork. Otherwise, black is just winning a piece. However, I did wonder, did white have some kind of defense like queen to e2? Just backing up, keeping in contact with the bishop, with the point that if black takes the bishop, then there's rook to c1 pinning the knight to the queen. This looks like it may regain the piece. For example, if black moves the queen somewhere, he can't stay in contact with the knight. And so if the queen moves out of the way, then white simply takes the knight and gets the piece back. And if black tries to support it somehow, well, this move is coming b3, kicking the knight away. So what does black do here? Well, I had prepared this, and I had planned queen to a5. And now white cannot take the knight. If he does, black takes the rook, and if white regains the material, he loses protection of his other rook. And when checking with the engine after the game, it tells me that yes, this is exactly the right plan. Queen to a5 was the only move in that position to retain the advantage. Okay, so you have to check all of these possibilities. Anyway, since queen to e2 doesn't work, knight takes e5, or rook takes the knight rather, was the best move in the position. Okay, although it should be a pretty simple win for black now that he's up in exchange. White does regain the pawn here, and the engine suggests I keep the queens on the board, but I couldn't resist at this point exchanging queens because this is a very easily won endgame for black, especially after rook f d8, which practically forces the exchange of rooks, because if the white rook leaves the d file, then the black rook will infiltrate on the 7th rank. So white did exchange rooks, and now with pawns on both sides of the board here, this is a pretty trivial win for the rook. The rook is just too powerful for the bishop. So both sides try to get the kings up. You want to get the kings active in the endgame. I want to push my pawn to a dark square here where it can't be captured. I'm going to get my king up into the game. And now I threaten to infiltrate with the rook on the e-file. He tries to cover the squares here with his king, so I can't get in, but that allows me to attack the bishop. And the bishop can't move without losing the b4 pawn. So he moves up with his king to defend, and then that allows me this square on e1. And once I get into his position like that, then his pawns are doomed. I can attack from many different angles. So it's over. He plays a couple more moves. He plays f5. I attack the g-pawn from behind, and when it moves up to defend itself, I then fork the king and the h-pawn. So the pawns start to fall, and it's an easy win, and my opponent resigned. All right, so that was an interesting new novelty I faced in the Scotch game, that f3. It turns out not to be very good, and it turns out I should have played a little more actively and less cautiously in that game, especially with that move d5 in the opening. I should have more seriously considered. All right, thanks for watching the game.